Empires don't usually die the way movies tell you they do. No single sword, no dramatic last speech, no perfect moment where the flag falls in slow motion. Real empires collapse like glaciers melting. Quietly at first, then all at once, and when people finally look up, the world has changed, and no one can point to one single minute when it happened. And in the last century and a half, one country has repeatedly been present, sometimes openly, sometimes from the shadows, at the turning points where old powers lost their grip: the United States. This is not a sermon about good and evil. It's a story about how power actually works. Money, trade routes, naval bases, intelligence networks, sanctions, propaganda, and the cold arithmetic of who benefits when an empire is pushed off the board. These are the empires that once ruled continents, spoke in the voice of destiny, and then discovered the brutal truth that history has no permanent owners. The Spanish Empire, the moment America stepped onto the imperial stage. By the end of the 19th century, Spain was no longer the titan that had once stitched together oceans with galleons and silver, but it was still an empire in the most symbolic sense. It still possessed territories that represented global reach and prestige is often the last thing an empire has left before it loses everything. Cuba was not just an island. It was a statement, an economic asset, a strategic position, and a stubborn reminder that Spain still mattered outside Europe. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had finished expanding across North America and was facing a new question that rising powers always face. What now? Industrial production was booming. Business interests wanted new markets. The Navy was growing. And political leaders were increasingly convinced that influence had to be projected overseas if the country wanted to compete with the old European giants. When tensions around Cuba escalated, the public story became one of liberation and moral duty. But the deeper reality was that the United States had reached the point where it wanted a seat at the table where empires divided the world. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was short, fast, and decisive, not because Spain lacked courage, but because Spain was trying to fight a modern industrial power with an imperial machine built for an earlier century. Spain's fleet was outmatched, its logistics were strained, its empire was stretched thin, and the United States had something Spain could no longer summon at scale: industrial momentum, and that strategic patience to turn regional crises into global opportunities. When the war ended, Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And those names weren't just dots on a map, they were keys. Keys to Caribbean roots, keys to Pacific presence, keys to the idea that the United States was no longer merely defending its hemisphere, but actively shaping the global order. Spain's empire didn't die in one battle. It died in the realization that the world had shifted to a new kind of power, one that could move fleets, capital, and narratives across oceans faster than Spain could react. For Spain, the loss was existential. It marked the end of imperial centrality. For the United States, it was a coming-of-age moment, the point where it stopped behaving like a nation that feared empires and began behaving like a nation that could build one without ever needing to call it that. The German Empire crushed in war, dismantled in peace, erased in rebuilding. The German Empire that emerged in 1871 was not an ancient imperial relic. It was modern engineered disciplined, an empire born in the age of factories, railways, and scientific nationalism. Germany's rise frightened Europe precisely because it was efficient. In a few decades, it transformed into an industrial giant with a military designed not for ceremonial parades, but for speed, coordination, and total war. By the time World War I erupted, Germany wasn't merely fighting for territory. It was fighting for recognition as the dominant power of a new European order. At first, it looked like a conflict that would remain. Europe's business a brutal contest among old rivals. But wars of exhaustion are decided by who can keep feeding the machine, and eventually, the United States entered the equation with exactly what Germany could not match: enormous industrial capacity, fresh manpower, and financial leverage. American entry didn't just add troops. It added inevitability. It told Germany that time was no longer its ally. When Germany finally collapsed in 1918, the empire fell and the Kaiser was gone, but the deeper destruction happened afterward in the architecture of peace. Post-war arrangements shattered Germany's imperial identity, stripped its military power, and destabilized its economy, creating a political vacuum so violent that it pulled extremists toward the center. Then Germany rose again under a different banner with a darker ambition. And this second rise forced the United States into a far more direct confrontation. In World War II, the United States didn't merely defeat Germany. It participated in dismantling the entire structure that could sustain German imperialism. Cities were destroyed, industry was targeted, leadership decapitated, territory divided, and Germany was rebuilt under new constraints that made the return of an aggressive empire structurally difficult. The irony is that America also helped resurrect Germany economically through Reconstruction, because modern power is not only about crushing enemies, it's about designing the future so the enemy can exist again, but only inside a system you control. Germany survived as a prosperous state, but the imperial dream, the idea of Germany as a hegemon dominating Europe by force, was buried under occupation, division, and a new order where American influence anchored the continent. The Japanese Empire ended by strangulation, fire, and a complete reset. Japan's imperial project was one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. A nation that had been relatively isolated, rapidly industrialized, militarized, and then expanded outward with a conviction that shocked the world. By the 1930s and early 1940s, Japan was not just winning battles. It was building an empire across East Asia and the Pacific, seizing resources, controlling trade routes, and declaring that it would not accept being boxed in by Western colonial powers. Japan's leaders framed their expansion as liberation from European domination. But for the people living under occupation, liberation often looked like another empire wearing a different uniform. To the United States, Japan's expansion threatened the balance of the Pacific and the principle that America would remain the dominant naval power in that ocean. The U.S. response before direct war was not immediate invasion. It was economic pressure designed to make Japan's war machine starve. Oil was the lifeblood of modern navies and air forces, and restrictions on oil and trade created a strategic corner: retreat and accept limitation, or strike hard enough to buy time and resources. Pearl Harbor was not a random act. It was a calculated gamble born from the belief that if Japan shattered American naval power quickly, it could secure an empire before the U.S. could fully mobilize. The gamble failed, and once the United States shifted into total war mode, Japan faced a force of production and logistics that turned distance into a weapon. The Pacific Campaign systematically cut Japan's supply lines, isolated its garrisons, and forced the empire into a shrinking circle of defense. Then came the firebombing of cities, a terrifying demonstration that modern war could erase urban life in a night. And finally, the atomic bombs, which ended the war in a moment that still haunts human history. But the end of Japan's empire wasn't only military defeat. It was institutional transformation. Under American occupation, Japan's political structure was rewritten, its military ideology dismantled, its constitutional identity reshaped, and the emperor once presented as a divine figure was turned into a symbol rather than a sovereign force. Japan would rise again as an economic powerhouse, but the empire itself was not allowed to respawn. It was not merely defeated. It was reset, redesigned, and reinserted into a system where its power would flow through commerce and technology, not conquest. The British Empire, the ally that lost the world without losing the war. The British Empire was the largest empire in history, an imperial network that spanned continents, controlled choke points, commanded navies, and shaped global trade like a machine built to last forever. But the 20th century introduced a problem even Britain could not solve: the cost of being an empire in a world where industrial wars consumed entire economies. Britain survived 2 world wars, but survival came with a price tag so brutal that victory itself became a kind of defeat. By 1945, Britain had won the war, yet it was financially exhausted, heavily indebted, and facing colonial populations that no longer accepted imperial rule as destiny. And this is where American power changed the nature of empire. The United States did not need to invade British colonies to replace Britain. It needed to become the center of finance, reconstruction, and global institutions, because empires can only survive if they can pay for themselves. With American-led systems like Bretton Woods and the dominance of the dollar, the post-war world increasingly revolved around U.S. economic gravity. Washington also had strategic and ideological reasons to oppose old-style colonial monopolies. Colonial empires restricted markets, and American power thrived on open access, free trade, and influence without formal ownership. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, but it also anchored Europe-Britain, include inside an American-designed framework. Meanwhile, decolonization accelerated. India's independence wasn't just Britain losing a jewel. It was the empire's psychological center collapsing. Across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, colonies pushed for independence, and Britain often found that the costs of holding territory were higher than the benefits, especially under international pressure and changing global norms. The British Empire did not fall in flames like Rome. It dissolved like salt in water, slowly, inevitably, until one day Britain was no longer the imperial manager of the world, but a key partner inside an American-led alliance system. It was not conquest. It was replacement. The crown remained, but the command center moved across the Atlantic. The Soviet Empire destroyed by exhaustion, outcompeted by systems. The Soviet Union built an empire that looked different from the old European model. It didn't always rule through colonies. It ruled through ideology, military presence, and political control across satellite states. And for decades, it truly rivaled the United States as a global superpower. After World War II, the world was split into spheres, and the Soviet sphere was vast. Eastern Europe, behind the Iron Curtain, influence stretching into Central Asia, an ideological reach that inspired movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Cold War, however, was not a single war. It was a long contest designed to test which system could endure. The United States understood a key vulnerability. The Soviet economy, while powerful in heavy industry and military production, struggled with innovation, consumer goods, flexibility, and global financial integration. So American strategy became less about direct confrontation and more about pressure economic, technological, and geopolitical. The arms race forced the USSR to spend enormous resources just to keep up. Proxy wars drained attention and money. Afghanistan became a bleeding wound, not because it was strategically glorious, but because it was costly, humiliating, and difficult to end. At the same time, American cultural and technological influence seeped through cracks, making Soviet citizens increasingly aware that the West offered a different standard of living and a different set of freedoms. When reform attempts arrived, they exposed the system's fragility rather than healing it. Once Eastern Europe began to break away, once the Union's internal republics pushed for sovereignty, the Soviet Empire entered a collapse cascade. Legitimacy evaporated, the economy staggered, and belief, always the real fuel of ideological empires, ran out. No American army marched on Moscow, but the Soviet Union still fell inside a global environment where U.S. strategy had helped shape the conditions of failure. The Soviet Empire collapsed not with a final battle, but a sudden silence, as if the machinery of a superpower simply stopped working, and the world woke up to a new order where the United States stood alone at the top. If there is one pattern running through these collapses, It's that modern empires do not always die from invasion. They die when they lose access to resources, when they lose economic credibility, when their ideology stops convincing their own people, when their alliances fracture, when their institutions can't adapt, when the cost of maintaining dominance becomes higher than the profit of keeping it. And the United States, whether through war, finance, diplomacy, or systemic pressure, repeatedly positioned itself at the leverage points that decide an empire's fate. Which leads to the most uncomfortable question of all, the one history asks every superpower eventually. If the United States helped end so many empires, what happens when the logic of empire turns back on the empire at the center of the world today? Because history is not sentimental. It doesn't reward power forever. It only rewards adaptation until it stops, and something else takes the crown.